Just tell us, what stage is the Imperial vaccine at?
So we're at the stage where we're testing it in our first volunteers. We're doing that very cautiously because safety is of paramount importance. So we've vaccinated 15 volunteers so far, going very slowly. And in the coming weeks, we'll be ramping up to include another 200 to 300 participants.
And what chance would you give the vaccine of success? I know it's difficult to put a figure on it, but do you think it's greater than 50%?
I think it's very difficult to predict. One of the things that we don't understand right now is what level of immunity you need to prevent infection. If you only need a very small amount of immunity, I suspect most of the vaccines that are being developed will actually work. But if you need a very strong immune response or a particular quality of immune response, we'll see that actually there'll be a shaking out of some of these candidates. We hope we'll be one of the candidates that's successful, but there's no certainty with any individual approach.
It's interesting to hear you say that there's so much we're still learning about the immunity that we are given from the virus and the immunity that we need. Is there a chance that a vaccine might not work at all?
No, I think that's a very low risk. I think because there are now so many different candidates being developed, we will see a number of these coming through. And of course, having a lot of different candidates being developed spreads that risk of failure. I think we're very lucky in the UK that we have two very strong candidates, the one from Imperial, the one from Oxford. And so we're pretty well placed, but there's still not a certainty that either of those two will work.
And of course, if the Imperial vaccine does work, when is the earliest that people could get their hands on it?
So we anticipate, if everything goes really well, that we'll get an answer as to whether it works by early next year. And we have put in place the infrastructure to make enough vaccine for the whole of the UK. So assuming that the funding is there to purchase that vaccine, we could have that vaccine rolled out across the UK in the first half of next year.
And would the UK take priority in that scenario?
Well, they would, but only because the UK has funded us up to this stage. So the UK are looking at doing an advanced purchase of the vaccine so that it's ready to go. That doesn't mean that it's going to be excluded from being provided to other parts of the world. It's just that we're living in that space where we don't know if this vaccine will work. As soon as we know it works, everybody will be queuing up and wanting to get hold of the vaccine. And there's likely to be a big gap between success in the clinic and actually being able to make it available for multiple populations around the world.
Yeah, as you say, the kind of rollout feels really key. It's interesting to hear you talking about early next year because I remember the time when government ministers were talking about possibly having a vaccine by September. I mean, that feels quite optimistic now, doesn't it?
I think that feels very optimistic, but there's all bets are off. It's still a possibility, but I think it's a really low possibility, partly because the number of infections in the UK have fallen so much, which is a great thing for the UK, but it means making testing a vaccine and seeing if it works so much harder. So in some ways, the better we are at preventing or reducing transmission, the harder it is to demonstrate whether a vaccine works. And that's why we're looking to do trials in other parts of the world where the transmission is much higher.
What kind of places are you looking to trial it?
Well, we're having conversations with colleagues in South America, in Africa. We don't yet have the funding to put those trials in place, so we're looking to design the studies and try and get the funding to move that as fast as possible.
And you're talking there about some of the challenges to rolling out a vaccine, partly being the low infection rate. Are you also worried that people may not actually accept taking it? What are the other challenges that you could see happening?
Well, I mean, I think one of the challenges is we're not so worried that people won't necessarily accept it. There will always be some people that have hesitancy around vaccines. I think that the wider pressure is actually that there's such a push to develop a vaccine that normally we would study a vaccine for maybe 2 years before we made it widely available to the general public. And of course, we won't have 2 years of safety for this vaccine or any of the vaccines that are being developed. And so they will still need to be introduced very cautiously with long-term follow-up, as that pressure to get a vaccine in and to get economies up and running is really very strong, and the need for a vaccine. It kind of changes the way we think about the approach. and changes the pressures that would normally be there.
Do you think there is a bit of a risk as well, as people, as you say, are so keen to get this vaccine, that criminals could see an opportunity to try and profit from selling fake vaccines online, for example?
That's definitely going to be something that the world is going to have to look out for. We're pretty certain that as soon as any of these vaccines are shown to work, everybody's going to want them, and there's going to be a big gap between getting them to work and getting them available across the world. And so there will always be fraudsters who may want to, fill the space by saying, "Oh, I've got this special deal where I've got a vaccine," and it's not actually the real thing. So that's something that needs to be watched very carefully.
You mentioned there the demand for a vaccine when one does become available. Who do you think should be prioritised in the queue?
Well, I think we really need to be looking at this from a global level. And there are structures that are being put in place. An organization called COVAX, which is linking Gavi, that makes most of the vaccines for low and middle income countries available, and CEPI and the WHO. There needs to be a massive piece of work. And I think people probably underestimate what a huge effort it will be to go from discovery to making billions of doses. Ultimately, that probably needs a number of vaccine candidates to fill that gap, rather than imagining we'll have one vaccine that's universally available across the globe.
Now, talking about the need to work internationally, we're not taking part in the EU's vaccine programme. Is that a mistake, or does it not really matter?
I don't think it matters at this stage, because everybody is just working so fast, trying to move things so quickly, that success will come from many different avenues. So in some ways, we haven't even got the luxury of time to look back and say, should we be involved in other schemes? We just need to keep our feet to the grindstone and just go as fast as we can.
Yeah, certainly. And it certainly feels as if the team at Imperial is doing exactly that. Now, while we've got you, I know that you've been extremely focused, of course, on the vaccine. But I just wanted to get your opinion on lockdown being eased. Are you comfortable with the speed that lockdown is being eased in the UK?
I think that's always it's always a delicate balance between trying to keep the number of infections, the transmission rate, the R value low as possible, but also making sure that the economy doesn't stall and everything come to a complete, just stop operating. And what I suspect we'll see is that there will be, several, rather than waves, cycles of virus coming back in different parts of the UK, and events like we've seen in Leicester, where we have to have regional lockdowns. And I think we're going to be living with a kind of opening up, closing down scenario, probably until a vaccine is available.
So quite a long while then, I guess, before the sort of real normal comes back again. Do you think it would help to make face coverings compulsory in shops and so on?
So I'm not a public health expert, so I'm not the right person to answer that. But there's clearly, we know that face masks do have some effect in reducing transmission rates. So I think where people can't socially distance, it will make sense. Now, when you start to get down to which precise scenarios you should or shouldn't be wearing a mask, it becomes more complex.